Welcome to VSOW. Today we are tackling, well, one of the most intellectually charged and, frankly, politically explosive terms flying around right now. We're talking about the word fascist and its application to contemporary U.S. political movements, particularly regarding Trump-aligned Republicans.
It really is an unavoidable conversation, isn't it? But, what so often happens with more heat than light. Lots of emotion, lots of sound bites. Not always much rigorous history or careful analysis.
Exactly. So that's what we're trying to do here. We've pulled together a pretty demanding stack of sources for this deep dive.
We're looking at Q&As with respected historians like Jonathan Zatlin and Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who have very different takes. We've also got commentary debating Nazi analogies pieces by Henry J. Karp, Noah Berlatsky. And then there's that widely cited list of 14 characteristics of fascism from Lawrence Brett.
And crucially, something I think is really fascinating, we're going to get into a large-scale academic study from UVDARE. It uses World Values Survey data to look at who, ideologically, is most open to non-democratic governance. That's quite a piece of research.
It really is. So our mission today, essentially, is to filter all this complexity for you, the listener. We want to impartially distill these arguments, the rigorous academic reasons against using the F word, but also the compelling historical parallels that critics point to.
Right. And that's psychological evidence, too. It's about getting that thorough knowledge quickly, so you can really understand the arguments swirling around in the current political discourse.
Precisely. It's about understanding the debate itself, not just picking a side.
Okay, let's unpack this. And I think we have to start where the biggest resistance usually lies, which is this need for historical precision, the argument made very strongly by comparative European historians.
Yes. When you hear political figures or commentators throw around the F word, the first and loudest pushback often comes from historians. Specifically, those who specialize in that interwar period. Their argument is basically, fascism was a specific thing, tied to a specific time and place.
And we're looking here particularly at the perspective of someone like Jonathan Zatlin, historian of comparative European fascism. What's his core objection? Why can't we use that label today, according to him?
Well, Zatlin insists on a very strict, very time-bound definition. For him, fascism, Mussolini, Hitler, Franco, was a unique response, a specific reaction to an absolutely unparalleled crisis after World War I. He argues you just can't lift that label and slap it onto a totally different society 100 years later facing different problems.
And it's worth reminding ourselves just how foundational those post-1918 crises were. This wasn't just a bad recession or political disagreement.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely not. I mean, think about the sheer scale of the trauma. First, geopolitically, you had the collapse of these enormous multi-ethnic empires. The Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, the Russian empires. Gone. That created immense instability, power vacuums, new weak states popping up all over Central and Eastern Europe.
Okay, so massive political upheaval.
Huge. Then second, the economic chaos was just devastating. We're talking hyperinflation, wiping out savings overnight, mass unemployment like never before, and then bam, the Great Depression hits, destroying any lingering faith in liberal market economics for millions of people.
And the third piece, which maybe gets overlooked sometimes, is the human element, those millions of veterans coming home.
Exactly, millions and millions of young men. Mussolini himself was one, right? They'd spent 4 years immersed in trench warfare.
Yeah.
Their whole reality was organized around violence, strict hierarchy, sudden death. Then they come back to what? Mundane jobs, if they could find one. And a political system, democracy that looked weak, chaotic, indecisive.
So their conclusion, or the conclusion many voters reached alongside them,
was that democracy itself was the source of the crisis. It brought chaos, weakness. And only an authoritarian regime, a strong man, could guarantee prosperity, stability, and crucially, national pride.
So Zatlin's critique, boiled down, is if a movement today isn't directly responding to that specific unique combination, collapsing empires, economic ruin, millions of radicalized veterans, then it doesn't meet the historical criteria for fascism.
Correct. For him, simply endorsing violence or being racist, or even, as he might accuse some figures today of doing, trying to sort of resurrect interwar rhetoric, none of that automatically makes you a fascist in his book. That term, for him, is anchored to those specific historical actors. Using it loosely risks, well, losing its meaning and power.
But the pushback to that, of course, is that if you define it so narrowly, based only on those very specific historical triggers, don't you risk ignoring the core underlying mechanics of the ideology? If it functions the same way, structurally, does the historical trigger matter as much?
And that's exactly where the counter-argument comes in. This is the if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck argument. It often relies on broader, more structural definitions, like the one you find in Merriam-Webster, for example.
Right, and that definition focuses less on the historical moment and more on the characteristics. How does it define fascism?
It talks about a political philosophy, right? One that exalts nation and often race. It involves a centralized, autocratic government led by a dictator, severe economic and social regimentation, and critically, the forcible suppression of any opposition. So, from this view, if a contemporary movement ticks these functional boxes, well, the label applies, regardless of whether it's 1923 or 2023.
Okay. And to make that structural comparison more rigorous, less just a feeling, we have the work of political scientist Lawrence Britt. He studied several regimes, Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, but also Suharto in Indonesia, Pinochet in Chile, and came up with this list.
The famous 14 characteristics, yes. It provides a kind of checklist, a framework to see if the patterns match up.
Let's touch on some of those. We often hear the first few cited. Things like powerful and continuing nationalism.
Right. Constant use of flags, patriotic slogans, symbols everywhere, creating this sort of manufactured, intense unity.
Then disdain for human rights.
Yeah. Justifying ignoring rights because of perceived threats, fear of enemies, need for security. Think approving torture, long incarcerations without trial.
Identification of enemies or scapegoats as a unifying cause.
Absolutely essential. Rallying people against a perceived common threat. Could be racial minorities, ethnic groups, religious groups, liberals, communists. Someone to blame.
Controlled mass media.
Either direct control or indirect manipulation, censorship, pushing propaganda, discrediting independent news sources.
Rampant cronyism and corruption.
Yes. Governance by friends and associates who appoint each other, use power to protect their buddies, and often, steal national resources.
And fraudulent elections.
Manipulating the system. Smear campaigns against opponents, changing voting laws or boundaries, using the judiciary to control outcomes.
Okay, those 6 are often discussed. But Britt's list goes deeper into the sort of inner workings of these regimes. What else did he identify? Let's get into some others.
Right, let's look beyond those. For instance, Britt's 5th point is the obsession with national security. This isn't just about defense, it becomes a constant, pervasive narrative.
How does that work as a tool?
Well, the government perpetually invents or exaggerates threats, both foreign and domestic. This becomes the justification for everything: massive military spending, suppressing civil liberties, building up a huge internal security apparatus. And the line between actual national security and just protecting the ruling party gets incredibly blurry, basically non-existent.
Okay. Then characteristic number 8 is also key. Labor power is suppressed. Why is that so central?
Because fascist regimes are inherently corporate in the sense that state power and corporate power become deeply intertwined. Organized labor, independent unions, they're seen as a direct threat. A threat to that centralized state control and, frankly, to corporate profits, which often benefit the regime's cronies. So, historically, independent unions were either wiped out or co-opted, replaced by state-controlled bodies. Worker rights take a backseat to production and stability.
And there's a very visible aspect, too. Number 9, obsession with crime and punishment.
Yes, a constant focus on law and order, making the streets safe. But it's often, a highly selective concern, maybe racialized, maybe politically targeted. Punishment is swift, often brutal, maybe public. Laws seem simple, but they're often applied unevenly to maintain this pervasive feeling of control and order. The state has to look tough, even if the enforcement itself is unjust.
And the military aspect. Point 7 was rampant militarism. How is that different from just the national security obsession?
It's related but distinct. This is about the glorification of the military itself. Soldiers become the embodiment of national virtue, the backbone of the nation. Military service is pushed as a top priority. There's this almost reflexive urge to use military might, both at home and abroad, to enforce national will. It also feeds into the whole aesthetic of power, discipline, and order that these regimes cultivate.
So by using this more detailed checklist, the full 14 points, critics argue they're doing more than just name-calling. They're applying a specific framework to see if a modern movement fits the structural template of historical fascism, even if the historical context, as Zatlin argues, is different.
That's precisely the argument. It shifts the debate from, is this 1933 Italy, to, does this movement operate using the same fundamental anti-democratic playbook?
Okay, but the moment you make those comparisons, especially comparing anything to the Nazis, you run headlong into that semantic warning. This is where Godwin's law comes in, right? The whole debate about whether invoking Nazis automatically kills the conversation.
Exactly. Godwin's law, which Mike Godwin first formulated back in 1990, initially suggested that, yeah, online, as a discussion grows longer, the probability of a comparison involving Nazis or Hitler approaches one. And the implication was this is usually over-the-top hyperbole. It trivializes the unique horror of the Holocaust and basically shuts down any reasonable debate.
And that feeling, that concern about trivialization, was very strongly held by Holocaust survivors themselves for a long time, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Like Elie Wiesel.
Oh, absolutely. For decades, Wiesel insisted the Holocaust was historically singular, a unique event of absolute industrialized evil. He felt strongly it shouldn't be used as a political analogy or, a rhetorical football. The fear was that if you compare other things to it, you inevitably water it down. You make future persecutions seem less severe by comparison.
But then things changed.
Yeah.
The political landscape shifted. We saw the open resurgence of actual neo-fascist white nationalist groups. At Charlottesville in 2017 was a big moment. Did that shift the ground for people like Godwin and even Wiesel?
It did. It was a critical turning point. Godwin himself revised his view. He basically said, look, when you are facing actual neo-fascist ideologies, people marching with swastikas chanting Nazi slogans, then the comparison isn't just appropriate, it's necessary. But, and this is key, it has to be done with intellectual rigor, rooted in reading history, as he put it, and careful justification. Not just as a cheap shot. The analogy transforms from hyperbole into an ethical warning.
And Wiesel's thinking evolved toward the responsibility to speak out.
Yes. Profoundly. His core message, especially later in his life, really centered on the moral danger of silence. That famous line, neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. For him, it became a moral imperative. If you witness injustice, if you see tactics emerging that echo those that led to the Holocaust, then not drawing the connection, remaining silent about it, becomes a form of complicity. The goal isn't to score points in an argument. It's to use history to prevent repetition.
Okay, so there's a moral duty to speak if the comparison is justified, but that's complicated by this other danger, the peril of false equivalence. You have to be precise.
Absolutely crucial. This is a major pitfall. Rabbi Henry J. Karp wrote very pointedly about this, criticizing the use of the term concentration camps for migrant detention centers under the Trump administration. Now, he was clear those centers were inhumane, a disgrace. But he argued the term concentration camp itself was inappropriate in that context.
Why? What was the distinction he was making, and why did it matter? How did that false equivalence undermine the message?
Karp's point was about intent and function. The Nazi camps, places like Auschwitz, Treblinka, were explicitly designed for industrialized mass murder, for starving people, working them to death. That was their primary purpose. The migrant centers, however horrific the conditions, lacked that specific, systematic, genocidal intent. So when critics used the most extreme term possible, concentration camp, it actually gave opponents an opening. They could accurately point out the differences, see, they're not being gassed or worked to death, and use that to claim the detention centers were somehow humane by comparison. It shifted the goalposts, muddied the waters, and allowed the administration to dismiss the very real human rights concerns by focusing on the inaccuracy of the label. It ended up, as Karp put it, undermining the message.
So the lesson is, using the most inflammatory historical term isn't always the most effective strategy for achieving justice. It has to actually fit the facts to serve the memory properly.
Exactly. It serves the historical memory and the cause of preventing future atrocities, only if the facts align. The goal shouldn't be just rhetorical shock value. It should be ensuring the comparison is justified, accurate, and ultimately helps stop the progression towards worse injustice. As Wiesel implied, we have to learn from these horrors, teach them, and do everything we can to stop today's villains from repeating them. The burden is on the speaker to get it right.
Okay, so moving away slightly from the semantic debate over the label itself, critics often point to specific actions, specific language as hard evidence. Evidence that even if you don't want to use the F word by Zatlin's strict standard, what's happening is drawn directly from that historical fascist playbook.
Yes, and a major moment that crystallized this for many commentators, people like Dana Milbank at The Washington Post, David Frum at The Atlantic, was the RNC's official statement in early 2022, when they declared the January 6th Capitol insurrection legitimate political discourse and censured Representatives Cheney and Kinzinger for participating in the investigation.
That seemed like a line crossed for many. And the parallel being drawn there wasn't just about the violence itself, but about something deeper.
It was about the formal endorsement of political violence, yes, but coupled with something else. The embrace and perpetuation of a foundational lie. A lie designed to delegitimize the entire democratic process itself.
Explain that connection. How does that mirror historical fascism?
Well, it directly echoes the Nazi Dolchstoss legend, the stab-in-the-back myth that became central to their rise after World War I. The lie was that the German army didn't actually lose the war on the battlefield. They were strong, undefeated. No, they were betrayed, stabbed in the back by enemies within Germany. Jews, communists, socialists, weak Democrat politicians, they supposedly undermined the war effort and forced the surrender. It was all their fault.
So the comparison is, the RNC's stance on January 6th and the broader Stop the Steal movement effectively created a new American Dolchstoss legend. The foundational lie being the 2020 election wasn't fairly lost. It was stolen by internal enemies, corrupt officials, Democrats, maybe even disloyal Republicans.
Precisely. And this foundational lie is absolutely critical for authoritarians, because once you establish that lie, once people believe it, it provides the justification for the next stage: violence, repression, crackdowns against those supposed internal enemies who betrayed the nation. Ruth Bendiat, the NYU historian who studies authoritarianism, she argues this is rhetoric straight from fascism. It conditions people to see violence as justified, to see political opponents not just as wrong, but as illegitimate enemies who must be dealt with.
And Bendiat and others like Henry J. Karp point to incredibly specific language being used today that isn't just similar to historical hate speech, but sometimes seems to be verbatim historical hate speech.
Yes, disturbingly so. Take the word vermin. When Donald Trump referred to immigrants, or sometimes political opponents, as vermin, historians like Bengat immediately flagged this. This wasn't just nasty language. It was the exact dehumanizing term used relentlessly by Hitler, by Himmler, and especially by Julius Streicher in his vile propaganda.
Streicher ran that notorious anti-Semitic newspaper, didn't he? Der Stürmer.
That's the one. It was filled with the most grotesque caricatures and comparisons. Jews depicted as rats, as disease-carrying insects, as poison. They literally ran cartoons showing, like, poison gas being pumped into the roots of a tree infested with rats, with captions explicitly calling Jews vermin. The intent behind calling a group vermin is unmistakable. It signals they are subhuman, parasitic, a plague that needs to be eradicated for the health of the nation. It's rhetorical preparation for systematic violence.
And then there's the rhetoric around racial purity, specifically that phrase about immigrants poisoning the blood of our country.
Yes. When Trump used that phrase, Henry J. Karp called it out as verbatim Nazi hate speech. Hitler used similar phrasing in Mein Kampf, but Karp also pointed out something fascinating. The idea itself is much older. It didn't start with the Nazis.
Where does it come from?
Karp traces this concept of needing to protect the purity of the blood all the way back to medieval Spain, to the Limpieza de Sangre, literally purity of blood laws that were first enacted in Toledo in 1449. These laws were designed to distinguish old Christians from conversos, Jews, and Muslims who had converted to Christianity, but whose bloodline was deemed impure.
Wow. So linking modern rhetoric back to 15th century Spain, what's the significance of that? Why does that deep history matter?
It matters because it shows this isn't some new idea. This concept of blood purity as the basis for inclusion or exclusion, this biological nationalism, it's one of the oldest, most enduring tools of persecution in the Western world. The Nazis didn't invent it. They just industrialized it and took it to its horrific extreme. So when modern rhetoric taps into this poisoning the blood trope, it's leveraging centuries of ingrained racialized fear. It reframes immigration or diversity not as a social or economic issue to be debated, but as a fundamental biological threat to the very existence of the pure nation.
And this ties into how certain groups are characterized, particularly immigrants. The rhetoric often paints them as criminals and sexual predators.
Yes, the constant accusations that immigrants are disproportionately rapists, murderers, drug dealers. This also has deep, ugly historical roots. It echoes the blood libel that haunted Jewish communities in Europe for centuries, that vicious, baseless lie that Jews ritually murdered Christian children. And the Nazis heavily played on sexual fears, too. That was a core part of their propaganda, the idea that Jewish men posed a sexual threat to Aryan women. It led directly to the 1935 Nuremberg laws, which explicitly banned marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jewish Germans, based entirely on this fabricated premise of racial and sexual danger.
So all this dehumanizing language, these historical tropes, they serve a purpose to identify and isolate what authoritarians call the enemy within.
Exactly. And this is a crucial historical sequence that Ruth Ben-Ghiat really emphasizes. When the Nazis took power, their first targets weren't necessarily the Jews for mass extermination. Their first targets were internal political opponents. When the Dachau concentration camp opened in March 1933, just weeks after Hitler became chancellor, its first prisoners were communists, social democrats, trade unionists, critical journalists, anyone who represented organized political opposition. The playbook is often eliminate internal dissent first. Consolidate power by crushing political opposition, often by labeling them the dangerous enemy within before you fully turn on the targeted racial or religious groups.
And this consolidation of power, this silencing of dissent within the system, this brings us to what Ben-Ghiat calls the mechanism of authoritarian bargains. What does she mean by that?
This describes what happens to the elites within a political party, like legislators, party officials, influential donors, once a leader starts using this anti-democratic rhetoric and these tactics. At some point, these elites face a choice. Do they stand up for democratic norms and potentially risk their careers, their power, their access, or do they make a bargain? Do they decide to protect the leader, to rationalize or ignore the abuses in order to maintain their own position and the party's hold on power?
And if they make that bargain, what's the consequence?
The consequence, Ben-Ghiat argues, is that the party inevitably slides further down the authoritarian path, because once that bargain is struck, the primary job of those elites shifts. It's no longer about governance or policy or upholding the Constitution. Their main job becomes defending the leader, deflecting criticism, enabling the leader's actions, no matter how outrageous. Criticism from within becomes toxic, career-ending. Accountability evaporates.
And she points to examples of this.
Well, the flip side, really. She highlighted Mitch McConnell's statement after the RNC censure vote, where he pushed back and explicitly called January 6th a violent insurrection. Ooh. That was notable precisely because it was so rare. It showed how powerful that authoritarian bargain had become within the Republican Party by that point. Pushing back was risky and unusual, illustrating how far down the path the party had already gone. Once the bargain is made, breaking ranks is incredibly difficult.
Okay, so you have these historical parallels being drawn, the specific language being flagged. What's the common political response from those being accused? We touched on it earlier, but it's worth exploring. This denial and projection mechanism.
Yes, it's almost a reflex action in politics today, isn't it?
Yeah.
When faced with the accusation of being fascist or authoritarian, the immediate counter is often, no, you are. The other side is the real threat to democracy.
And we see this specifically from the political right in the U.S. responding to the fascist label. What arguments do they typically use to claim the American left is the actual fascist threat?
Well, the arguments usually center on things like government power and control. They'll point to Democrats wanting to expand government, citing things like the proposal for 87,000 new IRS agents as an example of growing state power. They'll bring up political violence, often focusing on the riots and property destruction during the summer of 2020 protests, framing that as left-wing political violence. They also argue that things like diversity initiatives or affirmative action policies are akin to fascist race laws because they treat people differently based on skin color. And of course, there's the argument about speech suppression, cancel culture, deplatforming, claiming the left is trying to silence dissent, which they equate to fascist tactics.
So the core claim is that the left's belief in centralized government, alleged use of political violence, focus on group identity, and attempts to control speech align more closely with historical fascism than anything on the right.
That's the essence of the counter-argument.
But the experts we've been discussing, Zatlin and Ben-Ghiat, they don't buy this equivalence at all.
Not remotely. Zatlin, the historian focused on the interwar period, dismisses the idea of fascism on the American left quite bluntly. He calls it basically a tactical move on the right to deny its own responsibility, a deflection. And Ben-Ghiat, the scholar of authoritarianism, identifies it as a classic technique she calls an authoritarian projection mechanism, and she traces it directly back to the original fascist.
Back to Mussolini. How to use this tactic.
He was a master of it. Mussolini consciously and consistently portrayed his opponents, the Democrats, the liberals, the socialists, as the real tyrants, the real oppressors who were holding Italy back. Meanwhile, he presented fascism, which was explicitly anti-democratic, nationalist, and relied on violence, as the movement of true freedom, order, and national liberation. The purpose of this projection is always the same. It's to justify your own authoritarian actions as necessary self-defense. If they are the real fascists, the real threat, then we are justified in using extreme measures, even undemocratic ones, to stop them and save the nation. It legitimizes repression as patriotism.
Okay, so we have the historical debate, the rhetorical analysis, the political projection. Let's shift now to the psychology. This UVA DARE study, using the World Values Survey data. This seems crucial because it tries to move beyond the labels and look at the underlying mindset. What were they trying to find?
Exactly. This research is so valuable because it sidesteps the whole "is it technically fascism"
Hmm.
fight. Instead, it asks a more fundamental question. In stable Western democracies today, who is actually psychologically open to authoritarian forms of governance? They looked at attitudes like willingness to accept a strong leader who bypasses parliament or elections, support for army rule in certain situations, or willingness to subvert democratic institutions. They crunched huge amounts of data from the World Values Survey across 17 different Western countries, looking for consistent ideological predictors.
And what was the single most consistent predictor they found?
The strongest and most consistent link across all 17 Western datasets they examined was what they termed the cultural conservative link.
Okay, how do they define cultural conservatism in this context?
They defined it pretty broadly based on common survey cautions.
Right.
It generally included things like adherence to traditional views on sexual morality, higher levels of religiosity and importance placed on God, strong anti-immigration sentiment, and a rejection of things like gender equality or rapidly changing social norms.
And this cluster of views was consistently associated with being more open to ditching democracy.
Consistently, more so than the standard demographic factors we often think about, like level of education or age or income or even how politically engaged someone was. This cultural conservatism factor was the most reliable predictor of openness to authoritarian governance.
Why would that be? What's the interpretation?
The interpretation suggested by the researchers is that for individuals holding these strong traditional cultural views, authoritarian governance might seem appealing. Why? Because it appears to be the most direct, decisive way to enforce social conformity, to uphold traditional morality, and crucially, to halt or reverse cultural changes they find threatening, like immigration or shifting gender roles. Essentially, they might prioritize achieving a specific vision of social order and cultural stability over the often messy, slower processes of procedural democracy and individual liberty.
That has pretty clear implications for political strategy.
Absolutely. The straightforward implication for any political elite aiming for non-democratic power is target your appeals directly to these cultural conservatives. Frame your authoritarian pitch in terms of restoring order, protecting tradition, and stopping cultural threats.
But the study didn't stop there. It identified an even more susceptible group, a specific combination of views they called the protection-based package. This wasn't just standard conservatism.
Right. This is where it gets really nuanced and I think particularly relevant for understanding current political dynamics. This protection-based package identifies individuals who combine those right-wing cultural conservative views we just discussed, but they pair them with fundamentally left-wing economic attitudes.
Left-wing economics. So what does that look like? They're culturally conservative, but economically progressive.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
These are people who strongly favor government intervention in the economy. They want redistribution of wealth, strong social safety nets, protectionist trade policies, government action to ensure economic security. They are not free market libertarians. They are not fiscally conservative in the traditional sense. They want a powerful state, but one that delivers on two fronts: protecting their traditional cultural values and protecting them from economic hardship and insecurity.
So a strong government that enforces cultural norms and provides economic security. And this group was found to be uniquely open to authoritarianism.
Yes, highly susceptible. They seem willing to trade democratic constraints for a decisive leader who promises comprehensive security, both cultural and economic. They want a state that acts forcefully to provide that protection. And they seem less concerned if democratic rules get bent or broken in the process.
And the study found this particular combination was especially potent in certain countries.
Incredibly potent. This specific protection-based attitude package, culturally, economically left, turned out to be the single strongest predictor of openness to authoritarian governance in about half the democracies they studied. But here's the real kicker, the anomaly. This group was the most susceptible in all 5 of the major English-speaking democracies included in the study: the US, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, and New Zealand.
All of them. Why the Anglophone world specifically? What's the theory there?
The researchers suggest it might be rooted in the specific political traditions of these countries. Anglophone democracies have a particularly long and deep history of classical liberalism, meaning there's a strong traditional link between procedural democracy, individual rights, and free market economics, or at least limited government intervention. Individual autonomy is highly prized. Therefore, the group that most fundamentally rejects this entire package, the group that wants a powerful state intervening heavily in both the cultural and the economic spheres, represents the most radical break from that core Anglophone democratic tradition. This might make them uniquely receptive to non-democratic alternatives that promise to deliver that comprehensive security the classical liberal model seems, in their view, unable or unwilling to provide.
That's quite a finding. It paints a very specific picture of the ideological terrain where anti-democratic sentiment might flourish most strongly in countries like the US or UK.
It really does. It suggests a specific vulnerability.
And it also offers potential insights for those trying to defend democracy, doesn't it?
It certainly implies strategies. For aspiring authoritarians, the advice remains: keep catering to cultural conservative, using rhetoric about threats and order. But for mainstream democratic parties, particularly maybe traditional social democratic or center-left parties, it suggests a possible way to counter this. If they could successfully offer a compelling economic alternative, really lean into addressing the economic anxieties and desire for redistribution within that protection-based group, while perhaps strategically de-emphasizing or reframing some of their more divisive progressive cultural stances, they might be able to split that susceptible constituency. Peel off the economically left-leaning voters by offering them security, thereby shrinking the potential mass support base for authoritarian actors who rely on combining both cultural and economic grievances.
A really profound insight into the sort of psychological and ideological mechanics that might be driving democratic vulnerability or resilience.
#tag outro.
So, okay, we've covered a lot of ground, bringing all these different sources together, the historians, the political commentators, the psychologists. What's the ultimate takeaway here? Well, it seems clear the academic and expert community is still pretty divided on whether the label fascist is historically accurate or analytically useful today.
Right.
You have some, like Zatlin, insisting it's a time-bound term that shouldn't be diluted.
Right. But then you have others like Bengott or Karp and those using Britt's framework, arguing that the structural patterns, the rhetorical tactics, the specific language, the parallels are just too strong, too systematic to ignore, especially when you see direct lifts from historical hate speech.
So the label itself remained contentious. But maybe the label isn't the most important thing. Regardless of what precise word we use, proto-fascist, neo-fascist, authoritarian populism, anti-democratic movement, the core political threat seems pretty clear from all these sources. It's the presence and normalization of political forces that actively undermine democratic norms and institutions.
Forces whose rhetoric often relies on dehumanizing opponents, using tropes drawn directly from historical persecution, and whose strongest base of support, as that UVA study suggests, comes from a specific ideological segment. Those who prioritize cultural conformity and economic security above all else, even above individual liberty and the rules of procedural democracy.
And thinking about historical parallels again, perhaps the most chilling one comes from the Weimar Republic itself.
Yes. That final, provocative thought to leave our listeners with. Weimar Germany, often called the finest democracy in Europe at the time, it wasn't ultimately destroyed by a failed coup like the beer hall putsch. It was dismantled, legally, through the democratic electoral process itself. Voters over time became convinced through relentless propaganda, fear-mongering, and the promise of order that a decisive dictator was better than a messy, accountable democracy. The Nazi Party only formally abolished democracy after they had gained power through elections and political maneuvering.
So if that's the truly dangerous lesson, that democracies can die, not just by force, but by voters choosing perceived order over constitutional accountability, does that mean our focus needs to shift? Maybe spend less energy debating the perfect definition of the F word and more energy actively identifying and contesting the behaviors, the rhetoric, the political compromises, those authoritarian bargains that normalize anti-democratic actions and pave the way for that kind of decay?
That's the question to wrestle with, I think.
A lot to think about there.
Indeed. And if you, our listeners, appreciated this deep dive into the source material, this attempt to unpack the complexities around this really difficult topic, please do subscribe, like, and maybe leave a comment. It really helps support the show and allows us to keep doing these kinds of in-depth analyses.
Thank you for listening to VSOW.